So I just realized something that I didn't put the dots together beforehand. So, Usopp's Black Kabuto, the slingshot upgrade that he gets after the time skip, right? I didn't realize that it grows depending on the amount of water that Usopp feeds it, because there is a standard grow up version and then the super grow up version that we see him use during the events of Dressrosa, in which he is sniping from far, far away at Sugar. With that being said, this is very reminiscent of the various hammer sizes that he gets in the pre and the post time skip, because the joke is the hammer keeps increasing in size to make the bluff more believable. But in the end, the bluff is just a bigger and bigger balloon. There is no hammer that weighs 5 to 1,000 tons, right? With that being said, it's very interesting that the slingshot, which is Usopp's primary weapon, has just inherited that joke. But instead of being a joke, the slingshot really does get bigger and it really does affect Usopp's arsenal. So I find it very interesting that that has been an occurrence all this time, which further bolsters the argument that if and when Usopp does get a real Giant's Hammer, like I've been talking about in several videos beforehand, it will most likely follow the same format as his slingshot. Perhaps too, if I'm correct, and the hammer is a Dell fruit user, perhaps a hammer that's eating a squirrel fruit, perhaps that squirrel, like I've said in the past, will too transform or get additional properties once it eats pop greens. Therefore, you have a complete synergized ecosystem of both of the bits of Usopp's arsenal, the hammer and the slingshot, being affected by pop greens. But with that being said, like and subscribe, give me your thoughts, and tell your friends about Polypede. What's it? So I know there are a lot of different fables and mythical creatures one could say that makes up Usopp's character, but another I think we could add to the list is Jack from Jack and the Beanstalk, because out of all the renditions of Jack and the Beanstalk, there is one central theme that holds true. Magic beans are the origin point for the giant beanstalk's growth, right? What are pop greens but magic beans? Because you plant them in the ground and some large piece of flora pops out. So that's where I think pop greens come from initially. A different spin on the concept of magic beans. Now, taking that further, the beanstalk itself probably is just in Skypiea, because it's literally called Giant Jack, and that's a very obvious reference to Jack and the Beanstalk, even though it wasn't being used as a climbing point to fell a giant, but it was used as a climbing point to fell a false deity in a way, in the form of Eniru. So here's what I'm thinking. What if the pop greens and maybe even the Boing Archipelago itself are all just from Elbaf? So let's say, I don't know, somehow, some way, the Boing Archipelago comes from Elbaf and ends up in the sea somewhere. But in Elbaf, there are many, many, many Boing Archipelago in a lake or something somewhere. And that's where pop greens originate from. I could see that being a possibility, because it's too weird that the pop greens share so much in common with Jack's magic beans. And the reason why I bring Jack and the Beanstalk up, of course, is because a giant is seen as a main antagonist in Jack and the Beanstalk. Though where Usopp does differ from Jack is that instead of a giant being an enemy to Usopp, the giants are a bolstering for his dream to be a great warrior on the sea, as he looks up to Dory and Broggy quite fondly. So, with that being said, there's also the point too, you could say, that Usopp is the savior of giants, because he did save the captain of the new giant pirates, Haruyan, from a fate of being a toy back in Dressrosa. So he is both an admirer of giants and a savior of giants. So with that being said, so in that way, Usopp is an inverse on Jack. Instead of killing giants, he both admires and saves giants. Another interesting twist that I think kind of brings all this together is that Skypiea, Elbaf, Little Garden, and the Boeing Archipelago all have relations to explorers, because Lewis Arnott talks about Little Garden in the book called Bragman, and we see this when Little Garden is starting up. Then the same Lewis Arnott goes to Elbaf at some point. So that's very interesting. We find that out in 1132. Then another explorer, Mont Blanc Noland, finds Shandura when it was still on the Blue Sea. Shandura is knocked up into the sky by the knock-up stream. On top of being an explorer, Nolan is also a botanist, as he saved the people of Shandura with his knowledge of botany. He is from the North Blue, which is kind of interesting because Heracles, a fellow botanist, is from the South Blue. And even though he isn't an explorer exactly, he did set off with the intention to learn more about botany from his home in the South Blue, which then led him to the Boeing Archipelago, which then killed all of his comrades. But out of it, he gained the knowledge of how to use pop greens on top of, I guess, beast mastery, as he's able to command a bunch of giant insects, which is also very interesting and might bolster the claim that, yeah, the Boeing Archipelago could be from Elbaf because it attracts the same sort of fauna, I guess you could say, or has the same effect on the fauna in the area as the, I guess, the vegetation or flora of Elbaf has on its inhabitants, as we have seen a giant grasshopper in Elbaf, like we've seen a giant mantis and giant beetles come from the Boeing Archipelago. So with that being said, this then leads into Usopp learning about botany from Heracles, who was sought out by Kuma due to his knowledge of botany, which is also a very interesting point. But yeah, that's how Usopp too becomes a botanist, and he gets the knowledge of how to use these said magic beans, these pop greens, in combat. So with that being said, that's all I have for today. So many mysteries to find in the land of Elbaf. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede. What's it? Okay, so I've made a lot of videos on the topic of Loki's hammer at this point, but after doing some logic sorting, I'm starting to think that it's very likely that Loki's hammer possibly is a Dofra user, specifically a squirrel Dofra user, and that squirrel is based off of the death squirrel that originally appeared in concept art for One Piece film Strong World and is seen in various variations in the video game One Piece Odyssey. Now, how do I come to this conclusion? Well, after thinking about it, here's a very funny thing. So, we know that Ohara burned down. Then we know that the books of Ohara's library were fished out by the new giant warrior pirates, Haruden, Gerd, and Goldberg at the time, presumably. Vegapunk watched them do this and then later visited, I guess you could say, the new library of Ohara in Elbaf as it was being curated by Jaguar D. Saul. So maybe when he was there, he taught the new giant warrior pirates the secret of putting devil fruits into items, because we know, I believe, at the tail end of Water 7, after Enies Lobby, we see Nami wiretapping a news report of some sort in which Vegapunk is credited with the discovery of putting devil fruits into objects, okay? So with that being said, it would make a lot of sense as to why so many of the new giant warrior pirates have animal companions who are devil fruit users, because we know that Road has Iscat, who is supposedly a cat fruit model lion user. We know that Goldberg has a living shield, who too could be a Delphi user. I know in the past I've gone back and forth on whether it's a homie or a Delphi user, but I'm leaning more towards Delphi user because of the connections I'm making. And now we know too that Gerd has an owl named Piper. Piper could be some sort of item as well, perhaps a doctor's bag or some sort of doctor's tool, as Gerd is the doctor of the New Giant Warrior Pirates. But continuing on with that, that leads me to believe that Loki's hammer probably is a Delphi user as well, given that so many members of the New Giant Warrior Pirates seem to have animal buddies that end up being Devil Fruit users, or items who are Devil Fruit users. So we have Road with Iscat, who seems to have the Cat Fruit model lion. We have Goldberg's mysterious living shield, whom in the past I thought was a homie, but given the precedent set by Iscat, it's most likely a Zoan. And then we have Piper, Gerd's owl, who too might be a Delphi user. The only ones out so far are Harrigan, the captain, and then the shipwright Stanson. So we'll have to wait and see if they have animal buddies as well. But so far, this seems to be a theme with them. With that being said, I do think, again, like I've said in the previous video, that Loki was once the co-captain of the New Giant Warrior Pirates with his brother Harrigan, because so far, when we're talking about the various variations of the Giant Warrior Pirates, they've always been co-captain. A generation before Harrigan and the boys, we have Brocky and Dory, who were the co-captains of the Giant Warrior Pirates. And before them, we have Jarl and Yorl, who were the old men in Big Mom's flashback, who are introduced as the former captains of the Giant Warrior Pirates. So throughout the history of the Giant Warrior Pirates existing, both old and new, they've always been co-captains. So that leads me to believe that Loki was a co-captain along with his brother once upon a time of the New Giant Warrior Pirates. So with that being said, it's likely that his hammer is a Devil Fruit user, and I think that Devil Fruit is a squirrel Devil Fruit that's probably going to be a variation on the death squirrels based on how many strong world animals that are appearing in Elbaf so far. So how does this trickle back down to Usopp? Well, I think after everything is said and done, Loki reclaiming his place as the captain, or rather co-captain of the New Giant Warrior Pirates, will be infatuated or grateful to Usopp for saving his brother once upon a time and gift him his hammer. Said hammer will be a squirrel. Said squirrel, I think, will be a reference to the variations of the death squirrel that we see in One Piece Odyssey, the video game, because in that video game you have various variations of this enemy with different abilities. Like there's an electric one and one that gives you kisses or something. It's really creepy looking. But I think the squirrel will react to whatever pop greens that it eats. So then the pop greens would give the squirrel different properties, and then in turn give the hammer different properties. How I think Usopp will be able to wield such a hammer is because I think in the Devil Fruit user being a giant hammer and the Devil Fruit in question being a squirrel, which may or may not be giant size, but that doesn't really matter, because when it comes to items eating Zoan fruits, size and proportion seem to vary wildly, and they seem to be very transformative. So what might seem to be a giant squirrel at one point can shrink down to the size of a normal size squirrel, possibly, just given the fact that it seems as though when you have a item who's using the powers of a Zoan Devil Fruit, they seem to have all these sort of extra abilities just based on the relationship they have between their item form and the form they have as an animal. Given, for example, say Funkfried. Funkfried was an elephant who was actually a normal sword. But in his hybrid state, he was this long serpentine elephant-headed sword. He's been an elephant with a sword as a nose. There are just a bunch of different forms that Funkfried was able to take, which is kind of weird when you think about it. The same thing goes for someone like Smiley. Smiley was Gas who ate the salamander fruit model axolotl. In being an axolotl and being a living creature, but also being like this big pile of ooze, it could be in multiple places at once, creating these sort of slime enemies. And said slime enemies had a degree of consciousness, so they could act, but they also retain the properties of the gas and they could explode given the flammable nature of the composition of the goop. So with that being said, what I mean is that rules do go out the window when we're talking about items who've eaten devil fruits. So going off of that, I think this will be great for Usopp because now we are giving him a power up in the form of this squirrel hammer, but then we're creating synergy between his ammunition, the pop greens, and the new hammer, which means the pop greens will now become still the central focal point of his entire set, because not only can they be used as ammunition, but once the squirrel eats a pop green, the squirrel, and then by extension the hammer, will gain an ability. Like, say, what if the squirrel ate the pop green that creates the impact wolf, right? So then the squirrel would then get properties of an impact dowel, presumably. So when it turns into a hammer, you're now getting the giant hit of the hammer plus the impact produced by an impact dowel, which then is a very sneaky reference all the way back to, say, Skypiea, or even more, I guess, immediately, the fight between Luffy and Usopp that happened. Usopp is always characterized through using dial technology. And this snuck its way back into the pop greens, which I think would come back around and sneak its way back into being a part of this new hammer set. So with that being said, I think there are a ton of possibilities that could occur from the squirrel gaining abilities from eating the pop greens. We may even find out that pop greens may originate from Elbaf, because we don't know what kind of produce the Atom Treasure Tree produces. So that would even be cooler. But with that being said, what if to play on the idea of this hammer becoming a flying squirrel and playing off of the idea that the hammers that Usopp would fake with would always be balloons before presumably this point in which he gets a real giant hammer. What if the squirrel ate the pop green that produces the trampoline that Usopp used in combination with Zoro during Punk Hazard? Now the squirrel can become a balloon itself and help perhaps Usopp to fly if he hangs onto it. And now with the squirrel floating, either grabbing onto Usopp or Usopp standing on top of the squirrel, he can provide a vantage point for Usopp to now snipe enemies from the sky above, which I think would be a pretty cool thing if that were to be implemented. But it makes me think that there are so many possibilities, even like, say, the bomb grass pop green. What if that produces an ability in which it creates a terrible explosion on hit when Usopp uses a squirrel as a hammer? There are just so many different avenues and possibilities to go down if this ends up being the case. And I think it creates, again, some very interesting synergy between old and new and gives the pop greens even more purpose. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works It! So, do you recall the giant goldfish at the end of the Little Garden arc? It is known as the Island Eater. He is classified as a Type C creature, which is a big savage. What's interesting about this giant goldfish is that it is a relative to the fighting fish of Dressrosa, whose meat is said to taste like sea beast meat. So that's very interesting that they taste like sea kings. But what's also kind of odd about this is that it's one of those examples of one of Usopp's lies coming true, even down to the whole bit about its poop becoming an island. Because in this case, the Island Eater's poop did in fact become an island because in chapter 129, Brocky states that the island eater swallows whole islands, which is in the name, and produces poop, which became the island known as Nani Monai Island, which is the island just before reaching Alabasta. We've never seen this island, but it's only mentioned by Brocky. So I thought all those things were super interesting. It's also very interesting that in both cases, both with the Island Eater himself and the dwarves on Dressrosa, we have these two very Usopp-centric things coming together in a way. Because two, the dwarves that were originally one lie told by Usopp. So it's very funny that one lie comes back to reference another lie in this case, which I find very interesting. What's also interesting about the goldfish being related to the fighting fish is that it gives us a few interesting narrative through lines because one, the goldfish is introduced in an arc that introduces us to the biggest form of humanity in the series, that being the giants. Then in Dressrosa, the goldfish's relative, the fighting fish, serves to introduce us to the smallest form of humanity in the dwarves, also known as the Tontata. This too is interesting when you look at Usopp, because Usopp sees the giants as heroes, and he both figuratively and literally looks up to them. However, in Dressrosa, the dwarves see Usopp as a hero because he lied and said he was a descendant of Noland, and they physically and figuratively look up to him as their savior, and he actually was their savior. So all in all, that's very interesting. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works. You know what's crazy about Usopp versus Van Augur? Usopp has always been better than Van Augur. Do you want to know why? Van Augur uses a scope. Not only that, he uses two scopes because there's a scope on his blunderbuss and there's a scope in his glasses. Usopp doesn't use a scope. He has goggles, but goggles aren't a scope. He has never used a scope on his slingshot. Every shot he has ever taken has been pure skill, and he's been accurate every single time with a slingshot. No gun, just a slingshot. So yeah, in terms of sniping, I don't know, bruh. Van Augur might be a tinge fraudulent, but give me your thoughts. Polypede Works here, and we have some early concepts of how Luffy looked back in the day when drawn by a 19-year-old Oda. Big thanks to Pew Piece for translating this for the community. Now, his name back in the day was Monkey D. Pow. So, with Luffy's name being Monkey D. Pow, we know that the surname Monkey was always on Oda's mind, and the middle initial D was always going to be a thing. Those things are important to take away. So, moving to the corner, we see the words stretch and sleep, which means that Oda always had on his mind that Luffy would always be able to stretch. Now, taking from that, I want to turn your attention towards his wardrobe. He is wearing an undershirt that has sleeves, striped sleeves. I think this could be a visual cue for him having the ability to stretch. And I think he picked this up from a mentor of his who he assisted under. And that man's name was Nobuhiro Watsuki. Nobuhiro Watsuki is the mangaka behind Rurouni Kenshin. In Rurouni Kenshin, there's a guy named Hanya. And Hanya had striped sleeves as well. In combat, these striped sleeves were to deceive his opponent into thinking that his arms were shorter than they actually were. So in a weird way, they were to deceive the opponent from his reach being longer than it was. With that being said, I think this translates back into the earlier designs of Luffy here, because I think the striped sleeves here were supposed to emphasize that Luffy's arms can stretch. There's something special about his arms. But I think that is a holdover from someone who Oda assisted under. Now, getting to the bandana, this is obviously a reference to devil fruits because of the swirls, but what the bandana could also suggest is that Luffy at one point could have been a thief, but I'm starting to think that that is more of a reference to the woman under the word thief as opposed to being attributed to Luffy himself. But the bandana that he's wearing could also be called a hokurumi, which is the Japanese bandana often associated with thieves in Japanese media. So the swirls could be a reference to that, and then over time they just got boiled down into being a part of the entire devil fruit concept. But taking the whole outfit in, you know who this is? It's not even Luffy, it's Usopp. Everything that Oda had for Luffy planned originally got reworked into Usopp, because Usopp, from the pre-time skip, has a bandana. Though with his bandana, it's more of like a grid pattern. It's not swirls, but still the fact that both of them have patterned bandanas is something to take into note. On top of that, Usopp has always worn a striped wristband on his arm. I think, too, the sleeves reworked themselves into that design element for Usopp as well. No one else has that. And then going down to the swashbuckler looking shoes, that too might have been reworked into being an Usopp themed thing, because Usopp has very simple shoes in the pre-time skip. Now, what's also very interesting about this is that earlier concepts of Usopp depict him as a more piratey character. So maybe based on what Oda had already planned for Luffy, he kind of went back to some old sketches and started to simplify Usopp's design when he had in mind what kind of character Usopp was going to be. Now, moving off of Luffy for a second, we have this old guy in the bottom left-hand corner who was supposed to be Mary. And next to Mary, it says Spirit of the Rubber Tree, 5,008 years old. So from this, I'm guessing Mary was going to be the spirit within the tree that Luffy got his powers from, because originally, and we've known about this for a while, the Gum Gum tree was supposed to be the only devil fruit bearing tree in the series, and Luffy was going to be the only one with powers as far as we know. So perhaps the spirit within the tree was supposed to be this old man, which is funny because we have Mary, the guy, and then Going Mary, the ship. The ship, of course, is made of wood. Trees are the suppliers of wood. So it's kind of funny that in a roundabout way we come back to the same point with this. And here, what's interesting too is that we see that the man who supposedly is the spirit of the tree is 5,008 years old. So again, 5 is an important factor when it comes to Luffy and his fruit, because as you know, 5 and 6 has always been attributed to Luffy throughout the series. And then we know the world government has been chasing the Gum Gum fruit for 800 years. So 8 is also an important number, I guess, as well, but to a much lesser degree. But moving on. But also, you get to see this is the start of Oda's laughing style being established, because I believe this is the old man saying, "An abandoned child, wah ha 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 ha. Isn't that just fine? Wah ha ha ha." So yeah, this is the start of the laughing style being established. So another interesting part to take from this is that there's an axe presented in this drawing. Now, we also have a early concept of what will become and then what will become Nami later in a woman named Rizuru. And from the early concept of Nami that was released years ago, I'm going to take a guess and say that the axe belonged to her, which is a very interesting thing that has never really come to fruition, of the Nami character holding an axe, but maybe it will in the future. But I find that very funny that even as early as 19, he's always wanted someone carrying an axe in the series. Following that, we have another old guy to the right. I don't know what he's about. He's just kind of a random drawing. He doesn't particularly look like anyone we've seen in the series. Kind of gives me a Zoro vibe, Not too sure, but yeah, interesting. Don't know about him. I don't know about him. Above Rizuru, we have a baseball cap, and next to the baseball cap has the word thief. So this probably means that he always depicted his female lead to be a thief of some sort. At least that's what I'm getting. Since it's right next to her, I don't think that was going to be an attribute of Luffy. I think that was going to be an attribute of his female lead. So Rizuru, I'm assuming, turned into Anne, and then Anne became Nami. So the girl was always going to be the thief character. Don't know about the baseball cap because no one on the crew currently wears a baseball cap. So I don't know where that came from, but we know what headwear is important. So maybe this is signs that he was always thinking about a hat, and then eventually the bandana that Luffy wears got translated to Usopp, and then I guess you could say Zoro as well. And then Luffy started wearing a hat, and then that hat became a straw hat later on. Don't know. To the left, we also see what was stolen was an apple, not a melon. That's good. And then we have, it was better than the worst. If that's the worst, then all right, time for a new journey. So the first quote, I think, is relating back to the Gum Gum fruit itself, or the Gomu Gomu no Mi, because the Gomu Gomu no Mi looks like a type of melon, specifically a Yubari King, which is this big green Japanese melon that kind of looks like a huge cantaloupe that is native to Yubari, Hokkaido, which is a small city in Japan next to another city called Sapporo. So yeah, the Gum Gum fruit is just a big Japanese melon. So that's why I think this quote is here. It's a reference to the fruit itself being a melon. Now, the second quote, I think, is just relating back to the idea of adventure that would end up being prominent in Romance Dawn and then prominent in One Piece. This also shares the same spirit as the box quote, which says, people who can laugh off their weaknesses are the strongest. This is a principle that has been taken to One Piece because, of course, a lot of the characters have unique laughs, and most characters have weaknesses or trauma that they are dealing with, and they power through that by laughing and doing their best to complete the goals that they have set off to do, whether those characters be good or evil. So that's about all I can glean from this early concept. I find it very interesting that so many things were planned out so early, and I can't wait to see where the axe is going. That's always been the big thing, because we've had axes in the series, but none in the main cast. So I can't wait to see if that actually goes anywhere. But with that being said, give me your thoughts. Penelope works here. Happy birthday, Usopp, king of the snipers. So, over the years, we have seen Usopp use a hammer. Said hammer has been a lie most of the time. The only time where the weapon was actually real and effective in being a hammer was against Chu in Arlong Park. All other times, the hammer has been used to more so shock the opponent as opposed to doing any real damage. So, here's the thing that I think is going to occur in Elbaf, and I bring this up now because we are ever getting closer to Elbaf being a reality. So, in Elbaf, I think Usopp will actually get a real giant hammer, a hammer that weighs hundreds of tons. And that hammer would be a Dofru user having eaten a type of squirrel fruit. So, how will Usopp wield such a hammer? I think it's possible that, seeing as how we have seen characters like Spandam have a sword who has eaten an elephant fruit, and despite Spandam being so weak, he's able to wield Funk Free no matter what form he's in. I think the opposite could be true in this situation. Even though the weapon is a real giant's hammer weighing hundreds of tons, because it's eaten a squirrel fruit, Usopp is able to wield it because the animal itself is small and light. So to Usopp, the weapon would be light. However, to anyone else that he is hitting, the weapon would actually weigh hundreds of tons. So with that being said, I have a suggestion on what the squirrel is going to reference. In Norse mythology, there is a giant tree called Yggdrasil. We see that there is a giant tree of some sort in Elbath, or at least that's what's being implied. We've seen it kind of off panel, I think, in a few shots. We've seen it at the start of Big Mama's flashback, rather. And we see that there is this giant tree, and based on the giants in One Piece being so rooted in Norse mythology, it is likely that the tree is Yggdrasil. So, two things, or rather three things, could be going on. One, there is a giant bird at the top of the tree, an eagle of some sort, or perhaps a rock, not sure. And then there is some sort of serpentine dragon at the bottom of the tree. In Norse mythology, this is called the Nihog. And then the bird at the top of the tree is referenced as the eagle. So there is a third party in this duo of animals called Ratatoskr. Ratatoskr is a kind of squirrel. This squirrel runs up and down the tree as he's spreading gossip between the eagle and the Nihog, so they would hate each other, right? This is very similar to Usopp's character because, as you know, Usopp is introduced into the story as a liar, and he uses lying as a hobby. They're ultimately white lies, but things get out of hand. Pirates come to his village. He tries to warn the people, but they don't believe him because he's always lying about pirates coming. So, Ratatoskr would also have a bad reputation as a liar in this context. Now, when it applies to One Piece, the squirrel in question who's playing the role of Ratatoskr could be one of two things. One, it could just be a squirrel who is actually a hammer. So a hammer who has eaten some sort of squirrel fruit. My bet, if this is the case, is some sort of flying squirrel, because it would be cool for Usopp to have a weapon that could just fly to him whenever he wants. And it kind of plays into the role of being a projectile in some cases. Like perhaps he could shoot the squirrel as a projectile, and then the squirrel turns into a giant hammer once it met the target. That'd be a cool thing. But the idea of it being a flying squirrel is something I could see. Now, the alternative is that we go full mythical zone, and the hammer in question has eaten the squirrel fruit model Ratatoskr. And in that situation, you can make Ratatoskr whatever you want. I know in the depiction that we have of him, it appears as though the actual mythical creature has some sort of horn. In Norse mythology, his name could loosely translate to Tusk Traveler or the Climber Tusk. It would be really interesting if the squirrel itself knows a lot about plants initially because of the legend of Ratatoskr. In knowing about plants, he would be a great help to Usopp because, you know, of course, Usopp's main focus in his artillery are the pop greens. So perhaps Ratatoskr could enhance any plant that Usopp makes and gives it more abilities, or perhaps just makes it bigger. And I think if he did have a horn, said horn would glow, and that's how he would potentially grow the plants, meaning growing Usopp's pop greens. And this is a very interesting ability because someone in the franchise has had this type of ability already. Not talking about Green Bull. I'm actually talking about the guy from FemZ named Benz. He had the Mosa Mosa no Mi, or the Grow fruit, in which he could enhance plants that already existed. So that's another just suggestion that Ratatoskr could have. Another interesting thing is that if he is a mythical Zoan and not just a plain red squirrel, this will be the first mythical Zoan who is actually an object. So meaning an object who has eaten a mythical Zoan fruit in the series proper. We've had things in video games before, but never in the actual series. This would also be a very interesting play because we have never actually heard the thoughts of a Zoan user who was originally a weapon. So perhaps in being a mythical creature, he can actually talk, which kind of makes him a more of a real character, but it would also sort of support the idea of him gossiping and spreading lies to the Ego, whomever that may be in One Piece, and the Nihog, whomever that may be in One Piece. I could also see the alternative in which it's just a normal squirrel, and the only one who can understand the gossip, presumably, is Chopper. That'll be good as well, making use of Chopper's very unique ability to talk to animals. Also, third option could be Ratataskor, and Ratataskor doesn't need to speak at all. You know, sky's the limit. Now, so in Marvel Comics, there is a Ratataskor. The Ratataskor in Marvel Comics is often associated with Squirrel Girl, and it itself is a shapeshifter. Sometimes it's a character known as Girl Squirrel. Sometimes it's just a full-on human woman by the name of Rachel Oscar. So yeah, in Marvel Comics, Ratataskor is a shapeshifter, like the idea I'm proposing here. So I just found that interesting. While on the topic of Marvel Comics, let's talk about what the hammer that the squirrel actually is would be. Both in popular culture and in Norse mythology, the hammer wielded by Thor is called Mjolnir. Now, will our hammer who has eaten the squirrel fruit have the same name? I think this is very likely because we have had complex names before that have related back to mythology and even the real world. For example, we have had a fireball named Prometheus. We have had a cloud named Zeus. We have had a sword named Napoleon. So that is very likely. A cool corruption of Mjolnir I could see happening maybe is Mole, which would be a cool reference back to Miss Merry Christmas, which was the first time in which the hammer lie started. Because, of course, back then, Usopp pretended as if he had a 5-ton hammer. So, with that being said, going forward, in Norse mythology, the hammer itself, as far as I know, could not generate lightning. So it's likely that it won't generate lightning in One Piece. I think that's really up for, say, NL and some of Luffy's attacks, who are called Thor and L Thor, respectively. Now, would there actually be a Thor in One Piece? I think it's very likely, seeing as how we have a Loki. It's very on brand for that Loki to have a brother, even if he's disgraced. For it makes sense for him to have a brother named Thor. On the topic of Thor, the whole worthiness thing that you see in the comics, like only one who is worthy can wield Thor's hammer, that's not a thing in Norse mythology. That's completely made up. In Norse mythology, the hammer is known for slaying a lot of giants and giant associated creatures like ogres, which brings up some very interesting thoughts about how the hammer will be treated in One Piece, because I have always held the belief that giants and ancient giants have beef because ancient giants are so much bigger than normal giants. And on top of that, we have been alluded to that Onis/ogres are associated with ancient giants in some way. Our first taste of this, presumably, is in Thriller Bark, as Gecko Moria does look very similar to Kaido and Yamato, as he is a big humanoid with horns, and he is our gateway into being introduced to the ancient giant known as Oars. So it's very likely. Same thing goes for Buccaneers, as it's very likely that Edward Newgate, Whitebeard, was a Buccaneer, and in his ranks he had Oars Jr., who is an ancient giant. So I'm just saying that the whole half giant thing has been around. So it's very likely that if this hammer does belong to a giant, it was used to actually slay ancient giants. Because a funny thing about Oars and Oars Jr. is that they wear skulls on their person. Oars wears skulls on his belt. Oars Jr. wears skulls around his neck in the form of a necklace. Based on how big they are and how big the skulls are in proportion to their body, it's very likely that those are skulls of giants. So they have eaten or killed giants and are using their skulls as trophies. So it will make sense that the giants in kind fight back in some way. I can see that being a thing. Now, another interesting ability that the hammer known as Mjolnir has in Norse mythology is that it can shrink down. I'm of two minds about this. Either the hammer itself will have this ability, and then the squirrel will just inherit this ability from the hammer, or, like I've said previously, the squirrel being significantly smaller than the hammer itself could just be a reference to the hammer's size alteration in Norse mythology. So the giant hammer being able to shrink down to the size of a small squirrel could just be a reference to that. Another thing of note is that the hammer is said to be invincible. I know we have an invincible material in One Piece known as sea stone. I'm of the mind that sea stone objects cannot eat devil fruits. So the next best thing is any of the ores in One Piece. Could be drunken iron ore, could be a offshoot of Wapple metal. Don't know, but most likely it's a tough metal of some sort. Not going to really claim what the metal will be or what the metal will come from, but it will most likely be a really tough metal. So to that, I kind of shrug my shoulders at. Another thing of note that I think might be very important is that the hammer is able to return to its user. This is canonical in Norse mythology, and it's referenced a lot in the Marvel properties. However, when you're talking about One Piece, I think if the hammer is a user of either a regular squirrel fruit or a Ratatasker fruit, it'll be cool if either squirrel was a flying squirrel so that the fruit could replicate that ability in returning to Usopp when the squirrel is a part from Usopp. Now, this is a little trivia bit that I just wanted to throw in here because I found it kind of interesting. So in chapter 1081, we have a color spread featuring all the boys of the Straw Hat crew taking a nap with a bunch of squirrels. This is a color spread, if you recall, that Sandy is reading a cooking book, but it's supposed to be a cooking book. But the point of interest is that I really do like, and I mentioned this when the chapter came out, that Usopp is sleeping peacefully with a squirrel, and the squirrel trusts him enough to protect the berry hoard that he has collected. In this situation, the berries could represent the pop greens. Just saying. And this is the only occurrence that we see in the color spread between Squirrel and Straw Hat member, in which the squirrel trusts says Straw Hat member with their food. So that could be a reference of things to come. Another bit of icing on the cake, and this is going to be a bit of a ramble, but there is a very interesting thing to note of how we can get a squirrel reference, or how squirrels could be relevant in the Elbaf arc, because we kind of have a bit of a long-winded connection. So in Thriller Bark, right? Thriller Bark is very good for Giants lore because we are introduced to oars. Moria has a attack called Shadow's Asgard, which is another reference to Norse mythology. But we also have the Rolling Pirates, who are captained by Lola. We know that Lola was supposed to marry King Loki of Elbaf. Her crewmates, the Risky Brothers, we later find out, had their shadows taken in Thriller Bark and put into squirrel zombies. This is very interesting because now, coming back to Elbaf, it's very likely that they are going to be in Elbaf because Lola actually married Gati. Gati is sort of Capone Beiji's right-hand man of the Fire Tank Pirates. So it's likely, seeing as how Lola married Gati in Beiji's cover story, and now the Rolling Pirates are a part of the fire tank pirates, it's very likely that we'll see the fire tank pirates again, which kind of brings back the sort of squirrel idea because, of course, the Risky Brothers, in being a part of the fire tank pirates, did have aspects of themselves, their shadows, put into squirrel zombies. And another reason that I should point out is that we meet the fire tank pirates in Whole Cake Island, which kind of submits their involvement with giants because, of course, Whole Cake Island is Big Mom's arc. Big Mom is grossly involved with giants, and Chiffon and Lola are her daughters. So whenever Chiffon and Lola pop up, Big Mom can't be too far behind. And whenever giants are around, Big Mom can't be too far behind either, because she's one of the few characters in the series who is very intimately involved with giants and their culture, as she was raised on Elbaf for a time. So yeah, however, I'm on the fence on whether the squirrel who is the hammer, whether it will be able to talk or not, because the squirrels that the Risk Brothers were, the squirrel zombies, they could talk. So it's kind of up in the air as to where that would go, but I can see it either way. So to wrap things up, I think Usopp is going to get a real giant's hammer. Said giant's hammer is going to be the user of some sort of squirrel fruit, either a normal squirrel or a mythical Zoan in the form of Ratataskor. I think because of the weird sort of logic that applies to objects who has eaten Zoan fruits, Usopp will be able to wield said hammer, because to him, the hammer will be as light as the squirrel. However, to others, it will be as heavy as the normal weight of the hammer, presumably hundreds of thousands of tons. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and give me your thoughts. Polypute Works here. Shout out to my co-host Reddit Sephiroth, also known as Zach, as he left a very interesting comment on my recent video called The Best Usopp Devil Fruit Theory. And his comment reads as this: given how long the Soul Fruit has been associated with Elbaf, from Mother Caramel to Loki's dealings with Big Mom, I wonder if Mjolnir will just be a hammer homie named Thor. I think this is a very interesting alternate possibility because of this, okay? We know that homies, right? Looking at Napoleon, that when they are weapons, they can increase and shrink in size. So, like Mjolnir in Norse mythology, possibly if Usopp gets said hammer homie, it will be able to do that. Now, another thing that's super interesting is that, do we know of any other occurrences other than Napoleon in which a weapon is a homie? Technically, yes, because when we see the giant pirates for the first time, when they're introduced to us one by one under Haruden, we are introduced to the cook, whose name is Goldberg. Goldberg has a very interesting looking shield. It has a funny face and its tongue is sticking out. So that could mean that perhaps either during Caramel's time or maybe later in Big Mom's time with her dealings with Loki, that as a peace offering, she offered the giants several homie items as a peace offering, as well as offering Lola up to Loki. I think that's a very high possibility. And if one of those items is still around, it could be wielded by Loki himself. So Loki could literally have a hammer, like Zach suggested, named Thor, and it could just be a tough hammer. Like with Big Mom and Napoleon, it could return to its user because, of course, it's a living creature. And in being a living creature, there's still a bit of room for it to eat a devil fruit, because, hey, it has a mouth, it can consume a devil fruit, so we still have room for the Squirrel Association if that were to happen. Another thing that I will say that could happen is that there could be, like, say, a special property of the hammer in which it can shift its weight. as well as shrink and grow. Because the funny thing about Napoleon is that Napoleon itself is a hat initially, right? When Napoleon is in battle mode, it has several modes. It has been a straight sword, it has been a cognac, it has been a cutlass, it's been a whole array of weapons. So that kind of informs me that when Big Mom, at least when she uses her own soul to make a weapon homie, that can do a large variety of things. So it's very, very likely that if she did gift a glut of homie weapons to the giants, that a hammer is one of them. And it would make sense that Loki would be given the most powerful of these weapons, because I would think that the premise for having such a weapon is that Big Mom was giving it to him as a wedding gift, and she ultimately was going to use the giants to make her pirate queen. So it makes total sense that Loki would have such a weapon, and that weapon was most likely be the most powerful of the weapons that Big Mom gifted the giants. Another factor that strengthens the idea of Thor the Hammer in this case being used as a wedding gift from Big Mom to Loki is because in Norse culture, the image of Thor's hammer Mjolnir was used as a fertility symbol in marriages. It's also associated with the growth of crops, and peasants and farmers really did enjoy Thor because he is associated with rain and thunder, which kind of goes back to having a plentiful harvest. So this also gives credence to the idea that perhaps Thor the Hammer homie in this case had some dominion over plants, which is probably where Loki got the flower to give to Lola, as we see in the anime and the manga. Now, I don't think he'll be as wild as Green Bull, but I think this is our way to get a canonical version of Benz. Now, Benz is from film Z. He had the Mosa Mosa no Mi, or the growth fruit. He fought Sanji, but the main point of his ability was that he could influence the growth of plants. And this also pairs very well with Thor the Hammer, because much like the plants that he grows, he too can grow and shrink. I can see that being a very high possibility that Big Mom would just give those abilities to him. Now, what would be funny is if during the events of Elbaf, we find out that Loki is just a goober, and in wielding Thor the hammer itself feels kind of unsatisfied with its wielder. So perhaps Usopp does something really cool in Elbaf, and then that inspires the hammer to follow Usopp. But the funny thing about the hammer is that maybe Loki was seen as a great warrior, but it was actually the hammer, and perhaps the hammer is the one that has all three types of hockey. So it has observation, it has conquerors, and it has armament. So perhaps in the fight that we will most likely see between Usopp and Van Augur, the hammer is literally telling Usopp where Van Augur is as an extra observation user in the fight against Van Augur, seeing as how he is a warp man. Okay, so in this situation, what if the hammer named Thor, like in Norse mythology, could return to its user, much like how those homie cannonballs changed their trajectory in Whole Cake Island? If you recall, Nami convinced the cannonballs that the Straw Hats were in another direction, and the group of cannonballs simply went that direction. So what in this situation, the hammer could actually return to Usopp upon Usopp's call. This will be interesting too in the fight against Van Augur, because if Van Augur tries to warp away from Usopp with the hammer on his person, Usopp can literally drag Van Augur back to his location as long as Van Augur is holding Thor the Hammer. Or perhaps he could sneak Thor the Hammer onto Van Augur's person, and then wherever Van Augur is, he can simply call the hammer drags Van Augur towards Usopp, which allows Usopp to shoot Van Augur. The final lie is Usopp's hammer? Let's get into it. So, in One Piece, Usopp has had a running theme of telling lies and those lies becoming true. When he was a child, he said he fought dragons and giant moles and Cerberuses. We've seen all those things in the story in real time. There was a Cerberus in Thriller Bark, Miss Merry Christmas was a mole in Alabasta, and there have been several dragons both in Punk Hazard and in Wano. So it's safe to say that all lies do become truth. With that being said, even if you want to go even further, Soki King technically exists because one of the fake Straw Hats dressed up as Soki King. Moving on though, what is a lie that hasn't been brought into a truth yet? Well, in Alabasta and in Thriller Bark, Usopp has this move in which he takes out this giant, unbelievably heavy hammer and strikes an opponent with it. The idea behind said hammer is that after bragging about how heavy the hammer is, the opponent faints from the shock from being hit with it, simulating in their minds that the hammer is actually as heavy as Usopp described it to be. Though we know this is not the case because it's usually a balloon with some pans in it or something. It's never an actual hammer. So how can this unbelievably heavy hammer become reality? Well, I think if we do go to Elbaf, which I hope we do because goodness gracious, are there a lot of characters tied up into Elbaf. I mean, Big Mom, Usopp, Robin, potentially. There are a lot of characters tied up in Elbaf. So if we go to Elbaf, here's what I think will happen. Since Elbaf is going to be rooted in Norse mythology, or we can at least assume that it's going to be rooted in Norse mythology, there's a very interesting character in the Norse mythology that kind of parallels with Usopp. There is a squirrel that runs up and down the great tree Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, and he's a bit of a trickster. He's a bit of a liar. He hates the world tree, and he is constantly starting up beef between the eagle and the Nihog, the serpent at the roots of the tree, in hopes that one of them will tear the tree down, okay? So he tells lies, he starts up stuff, which is what early Usopp did. I think since Elbaf will be rooted in Norse mythology and we already have a guy named Loki, I propose that somewhere on Elbaf, perhaps in the Royal Guard, perhaps he's a pet, I think there's going to be a hammer. However, this giant's hammer, this unbelievably big hammer, is going to be a devil fruit user. I don't think it's going to be anything mythical like that. I think it's just going to be a red squirrel. A hammer would have eaten a red squirrel fruit. Said squirrel perhaps is mischievous in some way. Perhaps he is a troublemaker. Let's just say the squirrel is mischievous, right? I think the squirrel, who is actually a hammer, will strike up a bond with Usopp along the Straw Hat's journey in Elbaf. And then once they leave Elbaf, he'll just become a permanent tool in Usopp's kit. The difference here is that based on how weird item zones are, I think no matter how heavy the hammer is, Usopp will be able to wield it because of the weird size difference between the squirrel being a regular squirrel and the hammer being large. And you get this weird discrepancy in size manipulation with item zones when you consider Spandam and Frunkfried. Frunkfried is a giant white elephant, yet Spandam can wield him as a sword, and it doesn't really matter what state he's in. So perhaps it works the opposite way when the weapon is big and the animal is small, and in such a way that Usopp can use the hammer, even though it's a giant hammer, and strike opponents, but to him, the hammer weighs as much as the squirrel. We don't have a confirmation that it could work that way, but I'm proposing that, seeing as how item zones work on this very weird floating logic, and they can seemingly do a lot of things
Remember, for example, Smiley? He was gas that ate a axolotl fruit, yet he had kind of Logia abilities, and he could even split himself up into multiple beings. Very strange. So I'm proposing that this could be the case for this unknown Ratatasker equivalent in One Piece. Perhaps this squirrel is able to be wielded like a normal hammer because of the weight discrepancy between the hammer's actual size and then the size of a red squirrel. And that would be the completion of the lie that the hammer weighs 10 tons or 100 tons, because it actually would. Not to Usopp, but to the person he's hitting. And then probably the narrative would shift between people being scared by the grandioseness of the hammer to calling Usopp's bluff, but being surprised that the hammer actually weighs that much. Which kind of reminds me of when Luffy did Gear 3rd for the first time against Lucy, and Luffy said, "My arm is now the size of a giant," and Lucy was like, "Well, that's just a balloon, that's not going to be effective," and then he found out. So I think it's going to be the same thing here. People are going to shift from taking Usopp's word to calling it nonsense and trying to challenge the hammer, only to find out that the hammer is real. This could also be a situation in which the hammer itself is legendary and then the fruit is not. So perhaps it's a legendary hammer that ate a mundane fruit instead of a mundane hammer who ate a legendary fruit. Or a mythical zone, I should say. But yeah, I think it's going to be one of those instances in which you have a giant hammer that has eaten a squirrel fruit, and then the hammer who's eaten a squirrel fruit will become Usopp's traveling companion. And if he is a caretaker of the giant tree that we see in Big Mom's flashback, if he's a caretaker of that tree, he doesn't necessarily have to be a messenger, but if he's a caretaker of that tree, that would mean that the squirrel has some background in botany. So perhaps he could organize Usopp's bag and help him with his pop greens. Or the tree that we see in Big Mom's flashback, which could be the Atom Tree, perhaps that has a whole new like breed of pop greens that the squirrel has collected, because we know squirrels collect nuts and berries. So even if he doesn't do that as a hobby, I would imagine that would still be a very useful companion to have to use as a sorting item to organize Usopp's ammo. Also, it would be a great companion to have on the ship to take care of Usopp's pop greens and their guard that they have. Another creative use of the squirrel would be to use it as an ammunition shot. Therefore, when the squirrel is close to the target, it would transform back into a giant hammer and completely decimate who was ever being shot at. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching. If you like stuff like this, please feel free to check out my YouTube channel, PollyP Works. And if you like what you see, I would appreciate your subscription. Thank you so much. See you next time.